Thank you all. How many of you are farmers? No farmers. How many garden? All right. How many eat? Okay, among friends. How many of you consciously try to avoid eating genetically engineered foods? Raise your hand. Okay? So I would say that looked about like 45%. I want you to rate yourself from 1 to 100 how vigilant you've been at avoiding GMOs. So 1 is, what's a GMO? 100 is no GMOs. Okay, so think about your number. How many are low vigilance? That should be most of you. 1 to 20. Raise your hand. 1 to 20. Come on. Raise your hand. There should be more people raising their hand. Not very vigilant. Okay, 20 to 40. 40 to 60. 60 to 80. 80 to 100. All right, so it was sort of evenly spread, with the largest category still being 1 to 20. So that was the pretest. We're going to see how vigilant you want to be at avoiding GMOs going forward in about 45 minutes or an hour. How active have you been at getting the word out about GMOs to other people? Most people are low active. That would be 1 to 20 on a scale of 1 to 100. How many are in that category, 1 to 20? Raise your hand. All right, large majority. 20 to 40, 40 to 60, 60 to 80, 80 to 100. Any 120s like me? All right, again, a pretest. Now, for those of you who are avoiding genetically engineered foods, how many of you noticed health benefits when you switched to non-GMO foods? Raise your hand. Okay, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right? Now, if you'd like, you can mention any symptoms that you'd like to share that have improved in your life since switching to non-GMOs. Anyone? Energy. Okay? Headaches. Energy and headaches. Anything else? Lack of bloating. Okay? I have to remember these. All right? Digestion. Digestion in general. Like before you were eating the GMOs, but you couldn't digest them, and now in the non-GMOs, digestion got better. Okay, anything else? All right, that's a good start. I want to share with you that these particular symptoms are not uncommon. When I was talking in Southern California to a group of about 120 people, about 20 of them described symptoms that improved when they got rid of GMOs, and I think only half the group was stopping to eat GMOs, so 20 out of 60 was pretty strong. And they also described bloating, some ulcers, a lot of digestive problems, acid. I don't think people wanted to discuss diarrhea or constipation, but I think that might have been involved. Headaches, severe headaches. This was not just in other audiences, but also in doctors' offices. You see, in 2009, the American Academy of Environmental Medicine said every doctor should prescribe non-GMO diets to every patient. And they said, when they looked at the animal feeding studies, that there were clear causal relationships between consumption of GMOs and problems in laboratory animals. And they described the particular categories. They described digestive problems, immune system problems, reproductive issues like sterility, organ damage, problems with cholesterol and insulin. They wanted the Obama administration to withdraw GMOs, to create a moratorium based on the research that was conducted up to that point. Now, up to that point, I had been interviewing scientists and sharing their concerns with the world about GMOs, and they were very concerned. But you know how scientists talk? They say converging lines of evidence suggest that it appears that GMOs might You know, if it's raining outside, there might be some precipitation. They don't speak English, which is why I have a job, basically, translating the scientists' concerns into English. But when I interviewed doctors at the American Academy of Environmental Medicine at their conference in 2009, just a few months after they had put this policy out, many of them had been prescribing non-GMO diets. And in fact, there are thousands of doctors across North America doing just that. But these doctors, when they answered my question, when they were being interviewed, it was kind of shocking to me because they didn't speak like scientists. They didn't say, it appears that GMOs might be causing problems in my patients. They were saying, GMOs cause inflammation, and inflammation is the basis of most diseases. GMOs cause gastrointestinal problems. GMOs cause my allergic reaction patients to have higher levels of allergic reactions, and they'll tell you that. Emily Lindner, who's in, many of these are in the film, Genetic Roulette. Emily Lindner said to me, blew me away. She said, I give all my patients strict instructions to avoid GMOs, and they all get better. It never doesn't work. I said to her, give me a percentage. Because I didn't really trust what I was hearing. She says, 100%. I went, how many patients have you been instructing to avoid GMOs? And she calculated how many patients she sees per year and how many years. She goes, 5,000. So I said, can I go to your office in Chicago and interview some of those patients? So she said, sure. I interviewed her patients. I interviewed other patients from other doctors' offices. And they described what we heard tonight. Bloating. They described ulcers. They described weight problems, skin problems, acne. And between them and others who have been giving us information from audiences and from unsolicited emails and from solicited emails, because we're now actually recording the symptoms, we're seeing the same problem categories that the American Academy of Environmental Medicine found in the lab animals. So we have people like, for example, in Dr. Lindner's office, one woman, irritable bowel, 4 weeks, she didn't have to take her 6 pills a day for the rest of her life, which she had been told she'd have to take. Another one, a week and a half, no more irritable bowel. I talked to someone 25 days into the non-GMO diet, 3 days into the diet, Crohn's disease, which she had for 30 years, disappeared. And she had lost 10 pounds already. And her skin condition was clearing up. A 12-year-old said he was debilitated 2 or 3 times a week by migraine headaches that would have him just lying down in awesome pain, completely gone. He no longer had to carry an inhaler because his asthma was also gone. He could play hockey without having wheezing. A 9-year-old had horrible pain in his gut for years, and finally, when he met Emily Lindner, non-GMO diet, the pain disappeared. Now, I asked these people also infertility. Someone said one of her clients, 5 years, no child, 3 weeks on a non-GMO diet, pregnant. I asked the people in the office and elsewhere, GMOs are not labeled, like you said. How do you avoid GMOs? The first thing they always say is, we buy only organic, or we buy mostly organic. And as soon as they say that, I think, oh, that's a problem. What else? And they may say, well, we're cutting out processed foods. And I go, oh, that's a real problem. And some say, well, because of my doctor's specific diagnosis, I'm cutting out dairy or gluten. And I'm like, I can't do anything with that. Because I represent scientists and science, and how many cofactors are there in an organic, non-processed, gluten-free, dairy-free diet compared to what they were eating before? How can we isolate GMOs as the cause? And yet the doctors were insistent that the GMO angle was key, the most important piece in many cases. But then, around the same time, I went to Chicago and interviewed Emily Lindner and her patients. I went to farms and the offices of veterinarians, and they told me about livestock which switched from GM corn or soy or both to non-GM soy or corn. And there were no cofactors. There were no gluten-free pigs, dairy-free cows. It was just swapping GM with non-GM. So a Danish pig farmer described that before he switched from GM soy to non-GM soy, he had massive problems with diarrhea among the piglets, killing many very often. He did not tell his worker when he switched to non-GM soy. But his worker came up to him after 2 days and said, "You changed the feed." And the guy said, "Uh-oh, what's the matter?" He said, "Diarrhea's gone." 2 days. Remember what we heard about from Dr. Lindner's office. Crohn's disease, 3 days, irritable bowel, a week and a half or 4 weeks. Diarrhea. He said, in the 2 years feeding GM soy, 36 pigs died from ulcers and bloat. We heard bloat tonight. But in the year after feeding non-GM soy, no deaths from those. Conception rate was a problem at the pig farm, and the conception rate went up after non-GMO soy was introduced. Litter size went up. The antibiotic use dropped by 2/3. Birth defects went from 13 the previous year to none. That was removing GM soy. At a conference this year, I asked farmers, how many of you notice that animals get better when they switch to non-GM food or feed? And about a dozen farmers raised their hand, and I started interviewing them. And one described an experience. He had gotten a call from his client. He was a farmer and a consultant. And the guy was really nervous and agitated and was stammering, could hardly get the information across. And he said, "What's the matter?" He says, "You told me to switch to non-GMO?" And the guy, he said, "Uh-oh, what's the matter?" He said, well, it turns out what happened was not what's the matter, but it was a complete revelation. He had switched to non-GM corn 11 days earlier. 2 or 3 days, actually exactly 3 days after switching to non-GM corn. And he was still feeding GM soy because he didn't have non-GM soy, but he had grown non-GM corn, so he could feed that. He and his brother were walking around the nursery where there were 750 piglets each in 4 buildings. And they noticed that something was very different. The behavior of the pigs was quite different, noticeably different. And one of the brothers said, "Well, maybe it's that non-GM corn," as a joke. And the other one said, "Yeah." But by day 11, it was no joke at all. It was so obvious. You see, about 14 years ago, one of these brothers, who was in charge of the nursery, was the target of jokes by his other brothers because he was the one that had the easiest job on the farm. So they'd always resent him until about 14 years ago, when his job became one of the hardest on the farm because the pigs were getting sick all the time. He had to constantly inject them. The cost of disease was phenomenal with all the antibiotics and other medicines. And the behavior changed. The pigs were no longer acting like little piglets. When they walked in, they went into the stall, the pigs would get up because they were lying down, they'd move around, but before they even left the stall, they'd be lying down tired and fatigued and sickly. But within days of switching to non-GM corn, they'd walk into the pig stall, pigs would be bouncing up and around, getting all excited, and then they'd leave and the pigs would still be playing like piglets. And it turns out when they were seeing the way the pigs were acting and seeing how low the disease rate had become, they realized that 14 years ago they introduced GM corn. They had blamed these problems on foreign genetics. In other words, pigs that had come in from Canada. So you can tell them now. And you could say, keep your GM feed out of Canada. So this is another story that I'm getting, and they showed me a graph, it's on the film, of medicine use dropping dramatically the moment that GMOs were taken out from the corn side. And we have stories of feedlot operators with 5,000 head of cattle didn't realize it until after he switched to non-GM that the more GM corn he was feeding his cows, the more the cows would die. We had miniature steers switched from non-GM corn to GM corn. 80% of this small herd died in 2 weeks. Couldn't process it, bloated up and died. There's thousands of livestock in India that have died grazing on GM cotton plants after harvest, where when they were eating non-GM cotton plants, there was no problem. I talked to a veterinarian. He writes the column, syndicated column, Animal Doctor, 25 to 30 million readers. He said when GMOs were introduced in the 1990s, he got a slew of letters from pet owners that their cats and dogs were developing gastrointestinal problems like diarrhea, inflammatory bowel, and immune system problems like food allergies and itching. So he told them, get them off the GMO soy and corn, and he's got a file folder full of letters from pet owners that said it worked. And others were following the specialized diet from their veterinarian, a very science-based diet, which didn't avoid the GM soy and corn, so the animals were not getting better. Now, if you look at the categories of problems that the American Academy of Environmental Medicine identified, principally immune system, reproduction, gastrointestinal, these are the problems that are getting better in the pets and livestock and humans that switch to a non-GMO diet. And they are among the disorders which are on the rise in the U.S. population since GMOs were introduced. I haven't tracked the Canadian population, but I would guess it's probably the same. In the U.S., inflammatory bowel disease up 42% since GMOs were introduced. Food allergies doubled. Multiple chronic illnesses nearly doubled in the first 9 years. People with at least 3 chronic ailments. Inflammatory diseases like Crohn's, colitis, chronic constipation, etc. Even diabetes is an inflammatory related disease, and we had some people in the audience say when they switched to non-GMO, the diabetes problem and high blood pressure was dissipated. So it is very interesting. I think it's far more than a coincidence that these things are going on and related. Now let me explain why I think GMOs could be the cause of such widespread diseases. We're going to start with the most popular variety of GMOs, herbicide tolerant, Roundup Ready. How many people have heard of Roundup Ready crops? Okay, maybe more than half. So here's the backstory. Monsanto scientists found bacteria growing in a chemical waste dump near their factory, surviving in the presence of Roundup herbicide, the world's most popular weed killer. And they figured, great, let's put it in the food supply. So they took the gene from the bacterium, allowing it to survive Roundup, and put it into soybeans. Now you can spray the field of soybeans, the Roundup Ready soybeans, with Roundup. and it kills all of the other plant biodiversity, but not the Roundup Ready soy. And so it is a weeding technology. The whole thing, the whole risk for the entire population and the world is to help farmers weed easier. Actually, it's to help Monsanto and others sell their weed killer. That's the truth. Now, Roundup was originally patented as a broad-spectrum chelator. Now, chelation, for those of you involved with alternative medicine or high mercury or other high metal content, is usually considered a good thing. You take something, it binds with the heavy metal, and it brings it out of the body. But in this case, it's different. The Roundup binds with trace minerals and minerals of all types and makes them unavailable for the plant to use. Then it promotes pathogens in the soil. So you have a weak, sick plant that has been disabled in so many metabolic pathways that it's easy to kill. And then you promote diseases in the soil which kill the plant. So it's a perfect storm, weakness and disease. The animals in North America, their primary food is Roundup Ready: soy, corn, cottonseed, canola meal, sugar beet pulp, alfalfa. They eat weak and sick plants that are devoid or reduced in essential trace minerals. Now, they're experiencing all sorts of physical problems, and when they take the liver samples from dead animals and send them in for evaluation, there's a universal deficiency among certain minerals like manganese, which is related to immune system and reproduction, etc. So now you have weak and sick plants, weak and sick animals, and we eat the weak and sick plants, the weak and sick animals, and we eat the residues of the Roundup, which can then further chelate the nutrients inside our bodies, making us weak and sick. So when you dismantle or reduce the mineral supply in the food supply, then a whole host of diseases can be triggered. But Roundup also directly is linked to cancer. It's directly linked to Parkinson's. It's directly linked to endocrine disruption. Endocrine disruption, hormonal imbalance, can mess up reproduction. So you have laboratory rodents that are fed Roundup Ready soy, rats whose testicles change from pink to blue on the GM soy. I usually like to let that sink in for a moment. Mice whose testicles were damaged, including damage to the young sperm cells. Female rats, changes in the uterus and ovaries. The DNA functions differently in the embryo offspring. Female rats were fed genetically modified soy, and more than half of their babies died within 3 weeks, compared to a 10% death rate among controls. The babies were smaller and could not reproduce. Hamsters, by the third generation on GM soy, most were sterile, and those that gave birth, the babies died at 4 or 5 times the rate, and many had hair growing in their mouths. Mice fed Roundup Ready corn had fewer babies and smaller babies. So Roundup may be linked with some of the reproductive disorders we're seeing in these laboratory animals, livestock, and humans. And there's a new organism that they found in the soil, in the feed, that's been sprayed with Roundup, and when it's in high concentrations of the feed, typically the animals have a high percentage of sterility and miscarriages. And they find this organism, which is tiny, size of a virus, in the aborted fetal tissue, in the amniotic fluid, in semen, and when they isolate it and then expose it to a chicken, it'll kill the embryo of the chicken within 48 hours. And that's being investigated. So another possible reason why Roundup may be related to infertility or miscarriages. So that's just the Roundup side. There's also information I'm going to show you later on slides with organ damage and early death rate, as well as cancerous tumors from Roundup. Then you have the other popular variety. I use the word popular not in as popular like, oh good, give me the Bt toxin from corn. Not that kind of popular. Bt toxin laden corn and cotton. The corn that produces its own toxic insecticide that breaks open the stomach of insects to kill them. Now the reason it's on the market is because Health Canada says Bt toxin has a history of safe use. You can look at it on the Health Canada website. FDA, same thing. Bt toxin is found in soil bacteria. And you can gather up the bacteria and spray it on plants, and it'll kill certain insects by poking little micro holes in their cells and killing them that way. But it doesn't have a history of safe use. When it was sprayed in the Vancouver region for gypsy moths, about 250 people had allergic and flu-like symptoms. Some had to go to the hospital. Another 250 or so in Washington State. So there was reactivity by the general population, and farm workers exposed to Bt had immune system responses. In fact, the experts at the EPA, actually the experts who advise the EPA, said there's clear evidence that this stuff can cause allergies and you need to investigate. But they didn't. They said it is okay to take the Bt toxin and put it into the corn plants where it produces the toxin at thousands of times the concentration as produced in the spray. They design it so it's more toxic than the spray. It even has properties of a known allergen. And now, mice that are fed the Bt toxin, the Bt corn, are getting massive immune system responses. Now, they claimed that the Bt toxin has no interaction with human cells. But in the Journal of Applied Toxicology this year, in February, a study came out which for the first time isolated the Bt toxin in corn, exposed it to human cells, and it poked holes in the human cells, causing leakage. And the authors speculated that this is the same mechanism by which the Bt toxin may kill insects. So it does poke holes in human cells. But they said, Health Canada, FDA, don't worry, Bt toxin is destroyed in digestion. Until last year, when Sherbrooke University Hospital in Canada found Bt toxin in the blood of 93% of pregnant women and in 80% of their unborn fetuses. So we have a substance that breaks holes in human cells in our digestive tract because of the food we eat, in our blood, in the blood of our unborn fetuses, and because their blood-brain barrier is not well developed, it might be in their brains. Now, the researchers at the hospital were wondering why so many pregnant women, and 2/3 of unpregnant women, had Bt toxin in their blood, because it should wash out fairly quickly. So there must be a regular source of Bt toxin that's causing it to appear in such a high percentage of tested patients. So they speculated that it was the milk and meat of animals that were fed Bt corn. So they were suggesting that the Bt toxin survived digestion through animals, and then again through the human digestive tract, and maybe bored its way into the bloodstream and got into the blood. But I think there's another explanation that may be more plausible. The only human feeding study ever published shows that genes from Roundup Ready soybeans, the inserted bacterial genes into that, transferred into the DNA of the bacteria living inside our intestines. Most of it, not all of it, and also the on switch, the promoter. And that this gut bacteria was unkillable with Roundup's active ingredient, glyphosate, suggesting that this transferred gene was continuing to function, putting out a Roundup-ready proteins, which means long after we stop eating genetically engineered foods, we may have these genetically engineered proteins produced continuously inside our digestive tract. This study was never followed up to see what happens when we eat corn chips. Because this is about the highest yuck factor I'm going to talk about until I show the slides. What happens if the Bt toxin gene transfers to the DNA of your gut bacteria and continues to function? It means we may have living pesticide factories producing a toxin that breaks open holes in our guts and ends up in our blood supply. And I think that is probably why 93% of pregnant women had Bt toxin in their blood, because it was being produced inside their own digestive tract. Now we go back to the beginning, years ago or a long time ago at the beginning of the lecture, when we started talking about what are the health effects that people are experiencing. Remember, one was gastrointestinal, right? Gastrointestinal. Now you have something that pokes holes in human cells and may be allergenic and continually produced inside of us, and has been known as actually to hurt or to damage the walls of the intestines of mice, causing the microvilli to break apart. So this just Bt toxin alone might explain the gastrointestinal problems, some of the immune system problems. You got the Roundup explaining some of the reproductive problems, and those are your two main GMOs, right? Then you have just the background noise, the side effects that result from the process of genetic engineering. You insert a gene, you take millions of copies of a soil bacterium, put it in a gun, shoot the gun into a plate of millions of cells, then clone the cells into a plant. The process of insertion plus cloning causes massive collateral damage. Up to 5% of the naturally functioning genes can change their levels of expression in the presence of a single foreign gene. You can have hundreds or thousands of mutations. So, with Monsanto's Bt corn, it not only has the Bt toxin in it, but a gene that is normally silent in corn was turned on, producing an allergen. So if you eat Monsanto's Bt corn, you're being exposed to an allergen called gamazine, which some people are known to react to, and it's not labeled. Be careful, this now contains a new allergen. In fact, there were 43 genes that were significantly upregulated or downregulated or turned on or switched off that are never evaluated before the crop gets to the market. They don't look at these things. This was an independent study done after the Bt corn was on the market. Monsanto's soybeans has as much as 7 times the amount of a known allergen, trypsin inhibitor. But we don't have that on the warning label. This is just the background noise, just the collateral damage that is the result of the process of genetic engineering. So that could also explain more toxins, more allergens, etc. So here we have highly dangerous additions to our food supply, corresponding with an increase of several diseases in North America that might relate to the very specific toxicity or allergenicity of these substances. When people stop eating them, they get better. When animals and livestock and pets stop eating them, they get better. When lab animals are exposed to them, they have these type of disorders. We are demanding more science. We are demanding real science. It is amazing how these things came to market. Do you know the reason why we have GMOs in our food supply is because of a single sentence in the FDA policy, which says the agency is not aware of any information showing that the foods created by these new methods differ from other foods in any meaningful or uniform way. We don't see any problem. We looked far and wide, under rocks, inside studies. We couldn't find any differences. Therefore, no safety studies are required. No labeling is required. The sentence was a lie. It was not an exaggeration. It was not a misinterpretation. It was a direct lie. Because years after this 1992 policy was enacted, a lawsuit by Stephen Drucker forced the FDA to turn over 44,000 secret internal memos. And there you can read the overwhelming consensus among the scientists working at the FDA was exactly the opposite. That GMOs were different, dangerous, and needed testing. And they warned of allergens, and they warned of toxins, and they warned of nutritional problems, and they warned of new diseases. And they were ignored, and their warnings were denied to have even existed. The White House had instructed the FDA to promote biotechnology. So they created a new position specifically for Michael Taylor, Monsanto's former attorney, to be in charge of policy at the FDA. Monsanto is the big biotech company. So the policy allows companies like Monsanto to determine if their own foods are safe. They don't have to tell the FDA. They can put it on the market without telling the government or to consumers. And Monsanto told us that Agent Orange and PCBs and DDT were safe until they were banned and taken off the market. Michael Taylor went from the FDA to Monsanto to become their vice president and chief lobbyist. Now he's the U.S. food safety czar. The person who I think is responsible for more food-related illnesses and deaths than anyone in human history is in charge of food safety in the United States. When independent scientists discover problems, they're typically fired, stripped of responsibilities, forced out, threatened, gagged, denied tenure, denied funding. When industry research is conducted, we've caught them red-handed, rigging their research to avoid finding problems, using tobacco science. They've got bad science down to a science. And when they find problems, nonetheless, they dismiss them as unrelated without scientific justification. So I'm going to share with you now, before the good news, there's good news coming. Don't leave now, you'll be really depressed for days. Whew, shake it off. But not yet. I got more bad news. I have just put together a new PowerPoint, and we're not going to go through the whole thing. We've already discussed many aspects of it. But I want to share this new piece of information or way of thinking that links GMOs to gluten intolerance. Gluten intolerance is a pretty big deal right now. How many people have seen the word gluten-free? Right? It's everywhere. How many people are gluten-free? All right? And there's gluten-free books outside on the table there. So people ask us, is there a relationship between GMOs and gluten? Is wheat genetically engineered? No, wheat is not. If wheat is not genetically engineered, and rye and barley are not genetically engineered, and they are big gluten containers, how can GMOs be related to gluten intolerance? Well, some of you may already have some ideas on that based on what we've talked about. And I'm going to share with you a glimpse as to my thinking as to why that's the case. U.S. GM crops. Soy, 94%. Corn, 88%. Cotton, 93%. It's not a lot of crops. Soy, corn, cotton, canola, sugar beets. Then there's papaya from Hawaii or China. And there's little zucchini and crookneck squash. There's 9 genetically modified food crops. So I'll tell you now, non-GMOshoppingguide.com. Non-GMOshoppingguide.com. There's thousands of products that have been third-party verified as non-GMO. You can also download an iPhone or an iPad application called Shop No GMO. Same thing, online or on an iPod, iPad, iPhone. So here's the basic concept. First, exposure to allergens. If you are already reacting to allergens, if your immune system is already stimulated, then you may become reactive to other things. So if you're eating a lot of allergens, you might start reacting to gluten. Now we know that sometimes it's very specific that you react to one thing and it can cross-react with something else. My proposal is that with GMOs, there's a lot more allergens in our diet. Second, impaired digestion. That seems to be an aspect of those with gluten intolerance and maybe also a cause. So we'll go through some of these things. And leaky gut, holes in the walls of the intestines. And that is highly correlated with gluten intolerance and celiac. So the exposure to allergens, we already talked about this. The process itself created gamazine in MON-A10. It created 7-fold increase in trypsin inhibitor, known allergens. This was the statement by the EPA Scientific Advisory Panel that I mentioned, very specifically saying GMOs, Bt toxin could act as allergenic sources. These are some of the problems that were found in the mice that were fed the Bt corn, and interleukin-6 is also associated with celiac disease, and it's on the rise in weaning mice and older mice that eat Bt corn. In Monsanto's own rigged research, they tried to hide it, but there's all these immune responses from the rats that ate the corn for just 90 days. Really pathetic lengths of time to test for crops, foods that are going to be fed to people for a lifetime. People in India, thousands of laborers are getting allergic reactions just picking the Bt cotton. Thousands of them, according to hospital records and pharmacy managers and investigative reports and doctors. GM soy that has properties of a dust mite allergen. So if you're allergic to dust, you might be allergic to GM soy. Now, impaired digestion. The bacteria inside our gut may become imbalanced. Now, the bacteria inside the gut is very, very insignificant for health. It's like another organ. It's part of our immune system. It's part of our digestive system. It helps process certain vitamins. And when it's out of balance, it can lead to a large number of diseases and disorders. Well, the only human feeding study showed genes transfer to gut bacteria. We talked about that. And so we may have problems there. But also, we eat Roundup in Roundup-ready crops. And Roundup is an antibiotic, means that it kills bacteria. In fact, it can kill bacteria in the gut of a cow, which normally controls botulism. So there's an explosion of botulism in certain areas that may be related to the Roundup residues in the grains that the cows are eating. In fact, there's also increased botulism in humans, and they find that sudden infant death syndrome may be in some cases related to chronic botulism levels in infants, which might be promoted because of the use of Roundup-ready crops. Impaired digestion, when they fed Roundup-ready soybeans to mice, the mice had lower digestive enzymes. When there's not sufficient speed to digest proteins, then they can lead to allergic reactions from a wide variety of foods. Also, there's more trypsin inhibitor, so there might be less trypsin, which helps digest. So again, it creates an opportunity for proteins to hang out in the gut, causing allergic reactions because they're not broken up as quickly. we have damage to the surface of the digestive tract. Okay? The Bt toxin caused damage to the microvilli in mice. Also, we have the stomach lining this is the stomach lining of rats that were fed Bt potatoes, causing a dramatic change in the architecture here as well as the intestinal lining right here. This is not from a particular gene that was inserted. This is from the process, the collateral damage that occurs as a result of the process of genetic engineering, causing dramatic changes to the gut walls that might impair digestion. Then you have leaky gut, which is correlated with food allergies, inflammation, autoimmune disease, and gluten sensitivity. Now, what can cause leaky gut? Can anyone guess? Bt, right. Bt creates holes and leakage in human cells. It's found in the blood, and it might be produced in our own intestinal flora. Soon after GM soy was introduced to the UK, soy allergies skyrocketed by 50%. And now there are health professionals, allergists, that say, we do not allow our patients to eat GMOs because they'll react to it, and they'll tell you that. Now, there's also parallels with autism. Autistic kids typically have leaky gut, imbalanced gut bacteria, damaged walls of their intestines, sounds familiar, and behavioral problems. Now, we talk about, so far, the intestines, the gut bacteria, and the immune system problems, but let's talk about behavior. In lab animals, livestock, and humans, there's evidence that when animals are on GMOs in laboratory settings, their behavior is different. We've seen that with agitation, irritability, anxiety levels among rodents. When farmers take their animals off of GMOs, they tell me the animals are happier. They've used that word, quote, happier, numerous times. And they describe it with pigs and cows. And they say the behaviors change because when they're on the GMO, they act aggressively, sometimes cannibalistic, sometimes antisocial, irritated. So when Dr. Don Huber was describing the behavioral changes plus the physiological changes of the lab animals and livestock that were fed GMOs at a German lecture last year, an autism expert came up to him and said, this is what we're seeing in autistic children. And I have in the film Genetic Roulette, The Gamble of Our Lives, 3 parents who took their autistic sons off of GMOs and all dramatically improved. Now, this is a new study that came out on the 19th. So this is very new. September 19th, 2012, for those that are seeing this later. Roundup Ready corn, or Roundup, or both, were fed to rats for 2 years until they died. Lifetime study. This is unprecedented for this type of research. Typically, the biotech industry does 90-day, or in some cases 28-day research. All treated groups, whether they were eating the Roundup Ready corn or the Roundup or both, died 2 or 3 times more than controls and more rapidly. They had chronic kidney deficiencies. The females had pituitary hormone damage. Sex hormone balance was modified. Males had liver problems at dramatically high rates and huge tumors. Large mammary tumors developed more rapidly and had multiple ones in the treated groups. So the ones that had tumors among the controls, a small percentage and a maximum of 1. In the treated, 2 or 3 tumors often, and when they got to be 25% of their weight, then they had to put the animals down because of laboratory practices. So they were having to euthanize these animals. Now, they did not expect this cancerous reaction, where up to 80% of the females and 50% of the males developed these massive tumors. They did not expect it. This was not a study in carcinogenicity. This was a normal toxicological study. And when did the problems start to show up? In the 4th month. How long are the industry studies? 90 days, 3 months. conveniently set up to test the animals before these serious problems showed up. So there's films online, there's press releases. What is the biotech industry going to say to this? Anything they can to distract. We know who they are, we know what their efforts are, and it's pathetic. Here's their big thing. You used Sprague Dawley rats. They're prone to tumors, so we have to throw out the research. Well, guess what? Monsanto's Roundup Ready corn was approved in Europe based on a study with Sprague Dawley rats. In fact, so many of the products that were approved, whether it was GMOs or pesticides, used these rats. In fact, even more important, the control was Sprague Dawley rats, the treated group was Sprague Dawley rats, and there was a huge difference. So what are you talking about? This was their scientific opposition. Another one, you had only 10 rats in the control group. So you can't have just 10 rats in the control group. It's not enough. How many rats in the control group in the studies used to get the GMOs approved? Maximum 10. So it's like, if you want to kick this one out, kick out all the studies and remove your crops and get them tested right. They were just scrambling, looking for whatever they could to try and say this was bad research. They, of course, attacked the people that did the research because that's what they do. When they're completely desperate and they can't find a way to convince people scientifically, they try and use an emotional argument. In fact, the same author was attacked by a scientist a couple of years ago, and he sued him for libel and won. And now that same scientist is attacking this study. So we have no post-marketing surveillance, no human clinical trials, no proper evaluation of the crops. Approvals are based on assumptions and rigged research from industry. So we don't know for sure if GMOs are causing problems, and we don't have to wait. We can take the doctor's advice from doctors and practitioners all over North America that are saying, here's a non-GMO shopping guide, use it, avoid eating GMOs. That single act of people learning about the dangers, whether it's from their doctors, from this talk, from books, has now resulted in signs of a coming tipping point. Non-GMO labels are one of the fastest growing label claims in America for 3 years. There are now thousands of people speaking out about GMOs and educating. 19 states have introduced labeling bills that never passed, but that's an indication of a change, because that has never happened before. California has a ballot initiative that's going to be voted on in November. There's a county near here that has another ballot initiative to create a GMO-free zone. So there is an opportunity for significant change. Now, I want to give you some good news. The good news is that this type of change is world-changing. It's not insignificant. We do not need the federal governments in Canada or the United States to come in and rescue us. They have been marching lockstep with Monsanto for 2 decades. But we do not need to convince them. We do not need to give them the power and then beg them to help us. We can look to what happened in Europe. In January of 1999, the biotech industry was still projecting a 95% takeover of all commercial seeds in the world within 5 years. They were planning to replace nature. But 3 weeks later, the gag order was lifted on Dr. Arpad Pusztai. He's the one that did the research that you saw of the stomach lining and the intestinal walls. His research was very powerful, the most in-depth GMO research at the time. And he discovered that the process of genetic engineering itself caused that type of damage. plus liver damage, smaller brains, livers, and testicles, damaged immune system. He went public with his concerns and was a hero for about 2 days. His director of his prestigious institute was calling it world-shaking research. Pustai had been given a $3 million grant by the UK government to figure out how to test for the safety of GMOs, so his protocols were going to be implemented into the EU regulatory process. But then 2 phone calls were placed by the UK Prime Minister's office, forwarded through the receptionist to the director, and that changed everything. The next day, Pustai was fired. The team was disbanded. The protocols were dropped. And Pustai's reputation was attacked mercilessly, with him unable to respond because he was gagged by threats of a lawsuit. But on February 16th, the gag order was lifted by Parliament. He got his data back. He could defend his research. But most importantly, on that day, and this is how I start the book, Seeds of Deception, his wife, Susan, who I know well, comes to the door, opens the door, and sees a bunch of reporters in front of her. And there's TV news vans parking along the street, and reporters running out of their cars to the front door. And she says, "You know we can't speak about GMOs. We would be sued." He goes, No, it's okay," holding a paper. "They've released your husband. He can talk to us." You see, these 30 press had been in a press briefing at the Rowett Institute, Arpad Pustai's previous employer for 35 years. And the director casually mentioned that the restriction on Pustai's speaking to the press had been lifted, and before he finished his sentence, the room was empty. And within 20 minutes, they were in Pustai's house, and within 2 minutes, they were all in his living room. And 700 articles were written within a month in the UK alone on GMOs. And 10 weeks after the gag order was lifted, the consumer concern in Europe was so high that Unilever, Britain's largest food maker, was the first to raise its hand and said, "No more GMOs in our European brands." Then Nestle's, then the Walmart subsidiary, then McDonald's and Burger King, and everyone, all the food companies in Europe refused to use GM ingredients in Europe, but not in the United States, where that whole Pustai affair was described as one of the 10 most underreported events of the year. So GMOs proliferate on the basis of ignorance. And now we're seeing a change. More and more people. How many people would it take in the United States, avoiding GMOs, to cause a Kraft food manager to say, "Enough is enough, we're getting rid of GMOs"? Remember, the same company, Kraft, the largest food manufacturer in the United States, has already removed GMOs in Europe, probably in Japan as well. They've seen how bovine growth hormone, Monsanto's genetically engineered drug injected into cows to increase milk supply, it's linked to cancer. We have educated people about that. It was kicked out of Walmart, Starbucks, Yoplait, Dan, and most American dairies. They saw a tipping point against that in the last few years. I think if they see any drop in market share whatsoever that they can attribute to non-GMO sentiment growing in the United States, that's the industry sell signal we need. Remember, what's working for us right now is that there's no consumer benefits. No one wakes up in the morning saying, "Gosh, I can't wait for my daily dose of Roundup. Give it to me straight." No one longs for their teaspoon of BT before getting going in the morning. There's no consumer benefits. There's the poison drinking, herbicide tolerant, and the poison producing BT toxin plants. So they're not going to have labels saying low GMOs, like low fat. They're going to get rid of them. Now, what if GMOs require labeling. 53% of Americans say they would avoid GMOs if they were labeled. You think the Kraft food manager, if they pass in California on November 6th, which means they have to label by July 1st, 2014, what do you think is going to happen between November 6th and July 1st? I don't think Kraft is going to want to label their products as containing GMOs, especially because we already see signs of a growing tipping point today. We see other states wanting to pass labeling laws. Vermont and Connecticut were ready to pass labeling laws. They even wrote in saying it won't start until 365 days after it passes in California. But why did they stop it? Because they were threatened with lawsuits by Monsanto. So if it passes in California and Monsanto tries the lawsuit and it won't work, then the other states are going to go, our turn. But it doesn't even matter, because the national brands that sell in California, they're not going to create one label for California and one label for the rest of the country. They're not going to create one formulation for California and another one for the rest of the country. We will see, in my opinion, a tipping point. Now, even if labeling doesn't happen, we already now have thousands of doctors prescribing non-GMO diets, millions of people trying to avoid GMOs. And I want to ask you a question. I'd like you just to test the theory that we have the ability to change people's diets. I'd like you to rate yourself from 1 to 100 how vigilant you'll be next week at avoiding GMOs. And next month. How many people would rate themselves as low vigilance? 1 to 20. Raise your hand. 1. 20 to 40? 40 to 60? A few. 60 to 80? More. 80 to 100. Largest group. So you can see, in about an hour, this was a turning point in your digestive lives. You're willing, perhaps, to give up brands that you grew up with. Rate yourself from 1 to 100 how active you'd like to be at getting the word out about GMOs. How many people are not particularly active? 1 to 20, raise your hand. 1. 20 to 40? 40 to 60? 60 to 80? 80 to 100. Vast majority, 80 to 100. So the same message that changes people's diet spontaneously goes viral. So we know exactly the type of information to change most people's diet, and now we've packaged that information into books, DVDs, CDs, lectures, PowerPoint, scripted PowerPoints that you can download, etc., etc. And it's just a numbers game. It's just an exposure game. It's just a matter of getting the information out to enough people so that the market share of the food companies selling GMOs shows a dip of any amount that they can point to anti-GMO sentiment, and we can take back our food supply. Now think about this. How important is it? We have been talking about health the whole time. We've been talking about our health, animal health. But the GMO issue, because of the nature of nature, is much bigger than that. When you release genetically engineered corn, it cross-pollinates with non-GM corn. It has contaminated the indigenous corn varieties in Mexico, the source of the world's diversity of corn. When you plant and release genetically engineered canola, it can cross with non-GM canola. It can cross with wild mustard. It can cross with brassicas, broccoli, cauliflower. So, how do you recall it? How do you recall the genes from the gene pool? They've released genetically modified mosquitoes in the Cayman Islands. How do you recall? Here, skeeter, skeeter. They want to grow genetically engineered salmon eggs in Prince Edward Island, ship the eggs to Panama, grow frankenfish there, then ship back the salmon to sell to Americans to eat. What happens if some of those eggs spill over and grow salmon in the ocean? Well, Canadian scientists found that when frankenfish, salmon, similar to the ones that are trying to be grown in Prince Edward Island, when they were fed adequately, then they survived fine with other frankenfish and with natural salmon. But when the food availability was reduced, these fast-growing salmon with extra growth hormones, so they're growing really fast, so they're voraciously hungry, when they didn't have enough food, they started to attack, kill, cannibalize, causing complete extinctions or population crashes in all the tanks. So what happens when the frankenfish escape into the ocean and have roving bad boys of the ocean killing and destroying the balance of the seas? How do you recall? So we can't. We cannot fully recall. We can dramatically reduce the exposure. If we got rid of GMOs, the amount of exposure of Bt toxin would go from a huge amount in the food supply to a tiny amount. But we can't eliminate it completely. And if we do nothing, what is the biotech industry's plans? We mentioned it earlier. To genetically engineer 100% of the commercial seeds in the world. And that was Monsanto's stated goal years ago. Now they want to genetically engineer the insects and the livestock and the fish, designed for greater profit. GMO. God move over. So who does it affect? The GMOs introduced today in this generation can change the entire nature of nature. So all living beings that interact with these outdoors, every human who eats, and I noticed that was most of you, and all future generations can be influenced negatively by this infant technology. Knowing the extent of the exposure, unprecedented in human and natural history, there should have been every attempt to keep these things in the lab with high security. The Environmental Protection Agency, I'm told, did an experiment with genetically engineered bacteria, created the bacteria, and monitored it miles away. It was found in every monitoring station. Now it's found everywhere on the planet. It's found everywhere on the planet where they check, because it's the nature of nature. So, knowing the threat, I want to say this. We have an incredible opportunity in this generation, given to us, oddly enough, by Monsanto. We have an opportunity to do more good with a greater scope of benefit than our ancestors could ever have dreamed of. Because we have the ability to protect the lives of our future generations and all of nature, all living beings. It is something, in my opinion, that must happen now, because there is a race going on. And the biotech industry is doing as crazy a job as they can to introduce as many different genetically engineered organisms into our environment and our food supply. And yet we are now seeing the growth of the tipping point. And it is something, because it's a matter of what we eat. We don't need a policy change. We just need education. So among all of the worst problems for health and environment that we have, and I put GMOs in that category, GMOs are probably the easiest to fix. So I encourage you to become part of this magnificent team and to celebrate, as part of your activism, as part of your education effort, what it is you're protecting. And perhaps hearing that what you're protecting, all living beings, all future generations, is also celebrating you. Thank you very much.